The heavy wooden doors of Raven's Hollow Castle's great hall groaned open, their iron hinges protesting against the weight of centuries. Lady Arya Blackwood stepped inside, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already begun to chafe her delicate skin. The autumn rain had soaked through her torn traveling dress during the 3-day journey from her family's estate, and now the cold stone floor beneath her bare feet sent shivers up her spine. "Walk," commanded Captain Roderick, the King's Guard whose scarred face bore testament to countless battles. His voice echoed through the cavernous hall, where shadows danced across ancient tapestries depicting the brutal conquests of kings long dead. Arya lifted her chin, refusing to let fear show in her emerald eyes. She had been raised as a daughter of House Blackwood, one of the oldest noble families in England, and she would not dishonor her lineage with cowering, even if these might be her final moments. The great hall stretched before her like a cathedral of intimidation. Massive stone pillars supported a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness, while flickering torches cast dancing shadows on the walls. At the far end, elevated on a dais of black marble, sat the Iron Throne of England, not the ornate seat of legends, but a practical chair of dark oak and iron, worn smooth by generations of rulers, and upon it sat King Edmund the Ruthless. Even seated, his presence dominated the hall. Edmund was a man in his early 30s, with the powerful build of a warrior who had earned his crown through conquest rather than birthright. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, framing a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel twist of his mouth and the cold calculation in his steel-grey eyes. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the battle where he had killed the previous king in single combat. "Approach," the king commanded, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. Arya walked forward, her bare feet silent on the stone. With each step, she became more aware of the courtiers lining the walls, pale-faced nobles who watched the proceedings with the morbid fascination of spectators at a public execution. Their silk garments and jeweled fingers seemed obscene against the backdrop of her own dire circumstances. When she reached the base of the dais, Captain Roderick forced her to her knees with a heavy hand on her shoulder. The impact sent pain shooting through her legs, but Arya bit back any cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Lady Arya Blackwood," King Edmund said, leaning forward in his throne, "daughter of the late Lord Blackwood, accused of high treason against the crown." "Falsely accused," Arya replied, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. A murmur rippled through the assembled courtiers. Few prisoners dared to speak in the king's presence, let alone contradict the charges against them. Edmund's lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile. "Falsely accused," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "Tell me, my lady, do you know what happened to the last person who claimed innocence before this throne?" Arya met his gaze without flinching. "I imagine you're about to enlighten me, your majesty." Another murmur, this time tinged with shock. The king's reputation for swift and brutal punishment was well known throughout the realm. "Lord Garrett of Westmere," Edmund said conversationally. "He swore upon his family's honor that he had never conspired against me. He begged for a chance to prove his loyalty." The king stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a predator preparing to strike. "I granted his request. I gave him a trial." He descended the steps of the dais, each footfall echoing like thunder. "Do you know what my trials entail, Lady Blackwood?" Arya's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to speak. "I know your reputation precedes you, my lord." "My reputation," Edmund mused, now standing directly before her. She could smell leather and steel and something darker, the metallic scent of old blood. "My reputation is that no one survives my trials. Lord Garrett certainly didn't. Neither did Sir Marcus the Bold, or Lady Catherine of Thornfield, or any of the 24 traitors who thought their noble blood would save them." The hall had fallen completely silent. Even the torches seemed to burn more quietly. "But I am not without mercy," the king continued, beginning to pace around her kneeling form like a wolf circling prey. "I offer each accused the same choice. You may confess your crimes, beg for forgiveness, and die quickly. Or," he paused directly behind her, and she could feel his breath on her neck. "You may accept my trial, survive the night, and you walk free. Fail, and you will wish you had chosen the executioner's axe." Arya closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of her father's final words to her before his death. Honor is not in never falling, my daughter. It is in how you rise. She opened her eyes and looked directly at the king. What exactly does your trial entail? Edmund's laugh was like the grinding of millstones. Curiosity, I like that. He returned to stand before her, his grey eyes studying her face with newfound interest. Most beg for mercy by now. You ask for details. Knowledge is power, Your Majesty. If I'm to face your trial, I prefer to understand what I'm accepting. Understanding, he repeated thoughtfully. Very well. The trial is simple in concept, deadly in execution. You will be locked in the castle's lowest dungeon from dusk until dawn. You will have no weapons, no light, and no aid. If you emerge alive when the sun rises, you are free to leave my kingdom and never return. And what am I to survive against? The king's smile was terrible to behold. That, my dear Lady Blackwood, would spoil the surprise. The silence in the great hall stretched like a taut bowstring. Arya could hear her own heartbeat, the distant drip of water from the ancient stones, and the nervous shuffling of feet among the watching courtiers. King Edmund stood before her, waiting for her answer with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. Arya's mind raced through her options, all of them grim. She could confess to crimes she hadn't committed and die with dishonor, or accept a trial that no one had ever survived. Yet as she knelt on the cold stone, she remembered the letter that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, a messenger had arrived at Blackwood Manor with urgent news. Her father's steward, Thomas Grey, had discovered evidence that someone was embezzling funds meant for the king's taxes, funds that appeared to be flowing to Scottish rebels. When Lord Blackwood had begun investigating, he had died suddenly in his sleep. Now Thomas was missing. The evidence had vanished, and Arya found herself accused of the very crime she had been trying to expose. Someone had orchestrated this carefully. Someone wanted her dead, and they had used the king's brutal reputation to accomplish it. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed she would break under pressure. You're thinking, Edmund observed, circling her again. Calculating. Most prisoners either weep or rage by now. You do neither. I'm considering your offer, Your Majesty. Are you indeed? He stopped in front of her once more. And what conclusions has that clever mind reached? Arya looked up at him, seeing past the cruel reputation to study the man himself. Edmund was intelligent. That much was clear from how he had consolidated his power after taking the throne. He was also paranoid, which explained the elaborate trials. But there was something else in his eyes, something that didn't quite match his fearsome reputation. I accept your trial, she said quietly. A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. Several courtiers crossed themselves, as if her words had invoked something unholy. Edmund raised an eyebrow. Just like that, no pleas for mercy? No proclamations of innocence? You've already decided I'm guilty, Your Majesty. Nothing I say will change that. Arya shifted her weight, trying to ease the ache in her knees. But you've also offered me a chance at freedom. Slim though it may be, it's better than certain death. Slim indeed, the king agreed. Tell me, what do you imagine awaits you in my dungeon? Arya considered this. Wild animals, perhaps. Starving wolves or bears. Or maybe trained killers. Men you've promised freedom to if they eliminate your prisoners. Interesting theories. Edmund began pacing again, his boots clicking on the stone. What makes you think you could survive what others could not? It was a fair question, and one Arya had been asking herself. She wasn't particularly strong or skilled with weapons. She had no military training beyond what her father had insisted upon for all his children, basic swordplay and archery. But she did have other advantages. I don't know that I can, she answered honestly. But I know that I must try. Must? The king's voice sharpened with interest. An unusual word choice. Why must you survive, Lady Blackwood? For the first time since entering the hall, Arya felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to show weakness. Because someone murdered my father and framed me for treason, because they expect me to die here, quietly and conveniently, because if I don't survive, they win, and my family's honor dies with me. Edmund had stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You believe you were framed. I know I was framed. By whom? Arya hesitated. She had suspicions, but no proof, and accusations made by a condemned traitor would carry no weight. That is what I intend to discover, should I survive your trial. The king was quiet for a long moment, then suddenly threw back his head and laughed, a sound that echoed through the hall like thunder. When he looked at her again, there was something almost like approval in his grey eyes. "Survive the night and you're free," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "Those are my terms. Do you accept them, knowing full well that you will likely be dead before morning?" Arya thought of her father, of Thomas Grey, of the real traitor who remained free while she knelt in chains. She thought of her younger brother, who would inherit the family's disgrace if she failed. Most of all, she thought of the smug satisfaction her enemy would feel when news of her death reached them. "I accept," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. King Edmund smiled, and for the first time the expression reached his eyes. "Excellent. Captain Roderick, escort our brave Lady Blackwood to her chambers. She'll want to rest before tonight's entertainment." As rough hands hauled her to her feet, Arya caught something in the king's expression, something that might have been anticipation, or perhaps even hope. But before she could analyze it further, she was being dragged from the hall, the whispers of the court following her like shadows. The great doors boomed shut behind her, and Lady Arya Blackwood was led toward what every rational person expected would be her final night alive. But as she walked through the castle's twisting corridors, her chin held high despite her bonds, she couldn't shake the feeling that King Edmund's trial might not be exactly what it seemed. Chapter 3. The Preparation. The chamber where Captain Roderick deposited Arya was nothing like the dungeon cell she had expected. Instead, she found herself in a modest but clean room, high in one of the castle's towers. A narrow window offered a view of the courtyard below, where servants hurried about their duties in the fading afternoon light. A simple wooden bed with fresh linens sat against one wall, while a washbasin and pitcher occupied a small table near the window. "This is unexpected," Arya murmured, as the captain removed her bonds. Roderick's scarred face remained impassive. "The king's orders. You're to rest, eat, and prepare yourself. The trial begins at sunset." How generous of His Majesty. Arya rubbed her wrists where the rope had left angry red marks. "Tell me, Captain, how many have been given such comfortable accommodations before their trials?" The older man paused at the door, his hand on the iron latch. For a moment something flickered across his weathered features, perhaps pity, or maybe respect. "None, my lady. You're the first." After he left, Arya heard the heavy click of a key turning in the lock. She was alone for the first time in days, and the silence felt both blessed and ominous. She moved to the window, pressing her palms against the cool stone sill as she surveyed the castle grounds. Ravenshollow was a fortress built for war, not comfort. Its walls rose like black teeth against the darkening sky, and guard towers punctuated its perimeter at regular intervals. Yet even from her elevated position, Arya could see signs of prosperity: well-maintained buildings, busy stables, and gardens that spoke of careful cultivation. Whatever else Edmund might be, he was clearly an effective ruler. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, though she wondered who would seek permission to visit a condemned prisoner. To her surprise, a young woman stepped inside, barely more than a girl, really, with brown hair neatly braided and intelligent hazel eyes. She carried a tray laden with food and what appeared to be clean clothing. "I'm Sarah, my lady," the girl said with a respectful curtsy. "I'm to help you prepare for tonight." Arya studied the servant's face, noting the genuine concern there. "You know what I'm facing." "Yes, my lady." Sarah set the tray on the small table, her hands trembling slightly. "The whole castle knows, but—" She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might overhear. "But what, Sarah?" The girl moved closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "My lady, I've served in this castle for 3 years. I've seen the others who faced the king's trial. They were different from you." "Different how?" "Broken," Sarah said simply. "Guilty. By the time they accepted the trial, they were already defeated men and women. They went to their deaths because they had nothing left to live for." She looked directly into Arya's eyes. "You're not broken, my lady. You still have fight in you." It was a small kindness, but after days of brutality and fear, it meant more than the girl could know. Arya placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Thank you. That gives me more hope than you realize." Sarah smiled tremulously. "The king? He's not what people think, my lady. Not entirely. There are stories—" "What kind of stories?" But the girl had already caught herself, stepping back with wide eyes. "I shouldn't speak of such things. Please, you must eat and rest. You'll need all your strength." The food was simple but nourishing: fresh bread, roasted chicken, vegetables from the castle gardens, and a goblet of wine to settle her nerves. As Arya ate, Sarah laid out the clean clothes: a practical woolen dress in deep brown, sturdy leather boots that looked like they would fit, and a warm cloak. "Why these clothes?" Arya asked, examining the garments. They were well made, but clearly chosen for durability rather than appearance. "The king's orders, my lady. He said you should be appropriately dressed for what lies ahead." After Sarah left, Arya changed into the new clothing, grateful for the warmth and freedom of movement they provided. The boots fit perfectly, and she wondered how the king had known her size. The thought was unsettling. It suggested a level of planning that went beyond simple cruelty. As the sun sank lower in the sky, painting the chamber in shades of gold and crimson, Arya found herself pacing. The waiting was almost worse than the fear. She had accepted her fate, but the uncertainty of what she would face gnawed at her resolve. A commotion in the courtyard below drew her to the window. Torches were being lit throughout the castle grounds, and she could see guards taking up positions at various points. Whatever the trial involved, it clearly required significant preparation. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made her heart race. This was it, then. The moment of truth was approaching. Chapter 4: Descent into Darkness. The footsteps stopped outside Arya's door, followed by the familiar click of the key turning in the lock. Captain Roderick entered, flanked by 2 guards she didn't recognize. In the torchlight, his scarred face looked more grim than usual. "It's time, my lady." Arya nodded, surprised by how calm she felt. The waiting was over, and there was strange relief in that. She fastened her cloak and moved toward the door without hesitation. "Stay a moment, if you please, Captain." They all turned to see King Edmund himself standing in the doorway. He had exchanged his royal robes for practical leather and wool, though the golden circlet on his brow still marked his status. His grey eyes swept over Arya, taking in her appearance with what might have been approval. "Leave us," he commanded the guards. Roderick hesitated. "Your Majesty, is that wise? She could be dangerous." Edmund's laugh was dry. "Captain, if Lady Blackwood were truly dangerous, she wouldn't be facing trial, she would be my ally." He stepped into the chamber, and the guards reluctantly withdrew to wait in the corridor. Alone with the king, Arya felt the weight of his presence even more acutely than she had in the great hall. Here, in the confines of the small chamber, he seemed less like a distant ruler and more like a man, albeit a very dangerous one. "You look better," he observed, studying her face. "Rested, well fed. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "As prepared as one can be for the unknown, Your Majesty." He moved to the window, gazing out at his castle as she had done earlier. "Tell me, Lady Blackwood, what do you know of my rise to power?" The question caught her off guard. "The common knowledge, I suppose. You defeated King Harold in single combat, claimed the throne by right of conquest." He was quiet for a moment, then continued without looking at her. "What the common knowledge doesn't include is why I challenged Harold. What drove a bastard knight with no claim to the throne to risk everything in a bid for ultimate power?" Arya waited, sensing that this was important somehow. "Harold was a monster," Edmund said quietly. "Not a conqueror or a warrior. A genuine monster who delighted in the suffering of innocents. His trials weren't tests of worthiness or attempts at justice. They were elaborate tortures designed for his amusement." He turned from the window to face her. "I killed him not for the crown, but because someone had to." "Then why continue the trials?" The question seemed to surprise him. "A fair point. Why do you think I continue them?" Arya considered this carefully. "Because they serve a purpose. Perhaps not the same purpose they served for Harold, but some function that justifies their continuation in your mind." "Very good." He smiled, and again she caught that hint of genuine warmth. "Far you see beyond the surface, that's rare. Your Majesty, with respect, if you have something to tell me about this trial, I'd prefer to know it now rather than discover it in whatever darkness awaits me." Edmund studied her for a long moment, then moved to the door. "Captain Roderick will escort you to the dungeon, but before you descend I want you to remember this conversation. Remember that things are not always what they seem." "That's hardly reassuring." "It's not meant to be reassuring, Lady Blackwood. It's meant to keep you alive." The journey to the dungeon took them deep into the castle's foundations, down spiraling stone steps that seemed to descend forever. Torches lined the walls at irregular intervals, casting dancing shadows that made the carved stone seem to writhe and shift. The air grew colder with each step, and Arya pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Captain," she said as they walked, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask, my lady." "How long have you served King Edmund?" "Since before he was king. I was with him when he challenged Harold." "Then you knew Harold's true nature." Roderick's step faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Aye, my lady, I knew." "And you believe Edmund is different?" "I believe," the captain said carefully, "that King Edmund is exactly what England needs." They reached the bottom of the stairs, where a heavy iron door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, Arya could see only darkness. The torch-lit corridor seemed warm and welcoming compared to the void that awaited her. "This is where I leave you, my lady," Roderick said. His voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. "The trial begins the moment you cross that threshold. It ends at dawn, when the sun's first light touches the eastern tower." Arya looked at the yawning darkness beyond the door. "Captain, one last question. Of all those who faced this trial before me, how did they die?" Roderick was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the dungeon's cold. "My lady," he said slowly, "that's just it. We don't know. Their bodies were never found." Before Arya could process this revelation fully, Captain Roderick had stepped back up the stairs, taking the torch with him. The iron door stood open before her, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness. She thought of her father, of her family's honor, of the mysterious enemy who had orchestrated her downfall. She thought of King Edmund's cryptic words and the strange kindness she had been shown. Most of all, she thought of the dawn that seemed impossibly far away. Taking a deep breath, Lady Arya Blackwood stepped across the threshold into the darkness. Behind her, the iron door clanged shut with a sound like the tolling of a funeral bell. The trial had begun. Chapter 5. Into the Abyss. The darkness that enveloped Arya was absolute, a living thing that pressed against her eyes and seemed to muffle even the sound of her own breathing. She stood perfectly still for several heartbeats, allowing her other senses to adjust to the absence of sight. The air was cold and damp, carrying the musty smell of ancient stone and something else, something organic and unpleasant that she couldn't quite identify. Behind her, the iron door was sealed shut. She could hear no sound from beyond it, as if the entire world above had ceased to exist. The silence was so complete that when she finally moved, the soft whisper of her boots against stone seemed thunderous. Arya extended her hands in front of her, feeling for obstacles as she took her first tentative steps into the unknown. The floor beneath her feet was uneven, worn smooth in some places and rough with debris in others. She could feel the walls on either side, cold, damp stone that wept moisture in thin rivulets. A corridor, then. She was in some kind of passageway. As she moved forward, her mind raced through possibilities. What could the king's trial involve that would require such absolute darkness? Wild animals would need some light to hunt effectively. Human assassins would face the same limitation she did, unless, the thought made her stomach clench, unless they were already familiar with this place, unless they knew every twist and turn, every obstacle, every hiding place. A sound ahead made her freeze, a soft scraping, like claws against stone or fingernails. Arya's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would kill her faster than any predator lurking in the dark. She strained her ears, trying to determine the source and direction of the sound. There it was again, definitely ahead of her and moving. She had two choices: retreat back to the door and cower there until dawn, or continue forward and face whatever awaited her. The first option was safer, but it felt like surrender. And something in King Edmund's final words suggested that retreat wasn't the answer. Arya took another step forward, then another. The scraping sound had stopped, but she could sense movement in the darkness ahead, a subtle shift in the air, a presence that hadn't been there moments before. "I know you're there," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The response wasn't what she expected. Instead of an attack or a growl, she heard something that chilled her blood, soft, desperate weeping. "Please," came a voice from the darkness, thin and broken. "Please don't hurt me." Arya's breath caught in her throat. The voice was human, female, young and absolutely terrified. But Captain Roderick's words echoed in her mind. The bodies of previous trial victims were never found. Was this some cruel trick? A trap designed to exploit her compassion? "Who are you?" Arya asked, keeping her distance. "My name is Elena," the voice replied through tears. "Lady Eleanor of Westfield. I've been trapped here for I don't know how long. Days, weeks. The darkness makes time meaningless." Westfield. Arya knew the name. It was a small holding in the Northern Territories, loyal to the crown. But she had heard no word of Lady Elena facing trial. "When were you brought here?" Arya asked carefully. 3 months ago, maybe 4. I was accused of conspiring with Scottish raiders, but I swear by all the saints I never—" The voice broke into fresh sobs. Arya's mind raced. If this woman had been here for months, she couldn't have been part of the official trials. Those were public events witnessed by the court. This was something else entirely. "Elena," she said gently, "I'm going to come closer. I won't hurt you." "No!" The voice turned sharp with panic. "Stay back! The others said they wouldn't hurt me too, but they lied. They all lied." "What others?" But Elena had begun muttering to herself, her words becoming increasingly incoherent. Arya could hear her moving away deeper into the tunnels, and the sound of her retreat was punctuated by desperate whimpers. Left alone again, Arya tried to make sense of what she had encountered. Either Elena was genuinely trapped here, which raised disturbing questions about the true nature of the king's justice, or she was an elaborate deception designed to test Arya's response to human suffering. Neither possibility was comforting. She continued forward, using her hands to guide her along the rough stone walls. The corridor branched several times, creating a maze that would be impossible to navigate without light. Each choice felt crucial, as if taking the wrong path might lead her deeper into the labyrinth with no hope of finding her way back. As she walked, she began to notice something odd. Occasionally, her fingers would encounter smooth patches on the walls, areas where the stone had been worn by countless hands feeling their way through the darkness. The thought that others had walked these same paths, faced these same terrors, made her feel less alone and somehow more afraid. Time became fluid in the absolute darkness. Had she been walking for minutes or hours? The cold was beginning to seep through her cloak, and her legs ached from the careful, tentative steps required to navigate safely. Then she heard it again, not Elena's weeping, but something else. Footsteps, confident, purposeful footsteps that seemed to know exactly where they were going. Someone else was in the maze with her. Chapter 6. The Hunter and the Hunted. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing off the stone walls in a steady, measured rhythm. Unlike Arya's careful shuffling or Elena's panicked flight, these steps belonged to someone who moved through the darkness with complete confidence. Someone who knew these tunnels well. Arya pressed herself against the wall, trying to control her breathing, as she strained to determine the direction of the approaching steps. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the echoes playing tricks in the maze-like passages. "You cannot hide from me, my lady." The voice that drifted through the darkness was male, cultured, and terrifyingly calm. "I know these tunnels better than the lines on my own palm. I know every dead end, every hidden passage, every place you might think to conceal yourself." Arya's blood turned to ice. This was it then, the real trial. She was the prey, and this man was the hunter. "Who are you?" she called out, deciding that silence would not serve her. A soft chuckle echoed through the passages. "You may call me Thomas, my lady. And before you ask, yes, I am the steward you thought was missing. Thomas Grey, faithful servant to your late father." The revelation hit Arya like a physical blow. Thomas Grey, the man who had discovered the embezzlement, who had vanished after her father's death, the man she had believed might be dead. "You're alive," she breathed. "Very much so, I'm afraid, though I suspect you will not share that condition much longer." The pieces began falling into place in Arya's mind with horrible clarity. "You killed my father. You staged the embezzlement to frame me." "Such a clever girl." Thomas's voice seemed to drift closer. "Your father was beginning to suspect the truth, you see. He was asking uncomfortable questions about certain financial irregularities. Questions that would have led him to discover that his trusted steward had been siphoning funds for years. Not to Scottish rebels, as the evidence suggested, but to my own private accounts." Arya began moving again, feeling her way along the wall as quietly as possible. If Thomas knew these tunnels, her only advantage was to keep moving, to deny him the opportunity to corner her. "So you poisoned him," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her rage. "A regrettable necessity. Your father was a good man, But he was also inconveniently honest. When he began investigating, I realized I needed a scapegoat. His devoted daughter, who had access to all the relevant documents and accounts, seemed the perfect candidate. And the king's trial was meant to eliminate me quietly. Oh, my dear girl, you still don't understand. Thomas's laughter echoed around her, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. The king's trial was never the plan. This is not his doing. Arya stumbled, catching herself against the rough stone. What do you mean? I mean, Lady Blackwood, that King Edmund believes you are facing his traditional trial, locked in a dungeon to face wild animals or hired killers. What he doesn't know is that I've been using these old tunnels for months to dispose of inconvenient people. The castle's foundations are honeycombed with passages from the original fortification. Most of them have been forgotten for centuries. The full horror of her situation began to dawn on Arya. The other trial victims never faced the king's trial at all. They faced mine, and unlike his theatrical tests of courage, mine has a much more practical purpose. Arya could hear him moving again, his footsteps deliberate and unhurried. He was playing with her, she realized. He could have killed her already if he'd wanted to. This was sport to him. But why? She asked, continuing to feel her way through the maze. And why not simply kill me in my cell? Why this elaborate charade? Because, my dear, when your body is never found, it supports the story of your guilt. A true innocent would have survived the king's trial, or so the people believe. When you simply vanish, it confirms that you were indeed a traitor who met the fate she deserved. Arya's hand encountered something unexpected, a gap in the wall where a passage branched off in a direction she hadn't explored. Without hesitation, she slipped into the narrow opening, hoping to put more distance between herself and her pursuer. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," Thomas called out, his voice now distinctly behind her. "I'm not a cruel man, Lady Blackwood. I take no pleasure in causing unnecessary suffering. Surrender now, and I promise your death will be quick. And if I refuse, then we continue this game until you're too exhausted to run, too weak to resist. The end result will be the same, but far less pleasant for you." Arya emerged into what felt like a larger space, a chamber of some kind where her whispered breathing didn't echo immediately back at her. She stood still, trying to get her bearings, when her foot struck something on the floor. She knelt and reached out carefully, her fingers encountering fabric, and then, to her horror, the unmistakable shape of human bones. Earl's skeleton, still partially clothed, lay crumpled against the chamber wall. Lord Garrett of Westmere, she realized with sick certainty, or perhaps Sir Marcus the Bold, one of the failed trial participants who had simply vanished into the darkness. "Ah," Thomas's voice drifted into the chamber from the passage she had just left. "You've found my collection. I do apologize for the morbid decoration, but disposing of bodies properly is surprisingly difficult within a castle. Much easier to simply leave them down here where no one ever comes." Arya's hand closed around something metallic among the bones, a sword hilt. The blade was gone, probably rusted away completely, but the crossguard and pommel remained. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. "I'm curious, my lady," Thomas continued, his voice growing closer. "What do you imagine King Edmund will think when you fail to emerge at dawn? Will he suspect the truth, or will he simply add another name to his list of guilty traitors who met their deserved fate?" Arya gripped the sword hilt tightly, her mind racing. Thomas had made one crucial error in his gloating. He had revealed that King Edmund was not complicit in these murders. The king genuinely believed he was conducting fair trials, not knowing that his steward was using the confusion to commit murder. If she could survive until dawn, if she could find a way out of these tunnels, she might be able to expose the truth. But first, she had to live through the night. In the darkness behind her, Thomas's footsteps drew steadily closer, and Arya prepared to fight for her life with nothing but a broken sword hilt and her determination to see justice done. Chapter 7. The Dance of Death. Arya crouched beside the skeleton, her fingers wrapped around the broken sword hilt as Thomas's footsteps echoed closer. The chamber felt larger than the narrow corridors, offering more room to maneuver, but also more space for her enemy to approach from multiple angles. She needed to think strategically. Brute force would not save her against a man who clearly had experience with violence. "I can hear you breathing, my lady," Thomas called out, his voice now seeming to come from the chamber's entrance. "Such delicate, frightened breaths. It reminds me of your father's final moments." The words hit Arya like a blade to the heart, but she forced herself to channel the rage into focus. Thomas wanted her emotional, wanted her to make mistakes driven by anger. She would not give him that satisfaction. "Tell me," she said quietly, shifting her position to put more distance between herself and his voice. "How did you convince the guards to let you into these tunnels? Surely someone would have noticed the king's steward disappearing into the dungeons." Thomas's chuckle was warm, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather over tea. "You assume I needed permission, dear girl. I've been planning this for months. There are passages that connect to the outer walls, exits that haven't been used since the original castle was built. I come and go as I please." Arya filed this information away. If there were exits to the outer walls, there might be a way to escape, if she could find them in the darkness and avoid Thomas long enough to reach them. "Besides," Thomas continued, "the guards believe I'm in my chambers, recovering from the grief of discovering your father's tragic death and your subsequent betrayal. I've been very careful to maintain that fiction." "The king will discover the truth eventually," Arya said, continuing to move quietly through the chamber. Her free hand encountered more bones. She was in some kind of charnel house where Thomas had been disposing of his victims for months. "Will he? I think not. You see, my dear, I've been very careful to choose my victims wisely. Nobles who were already under suspicion, people whose guilt seemed plausible to the court. When they vanish during the king's trials, it merely reinforces his reputation for swift justice." Arya's foot struck something that clinked metallically, another weapon perhaps, or pieces of armor from one of the victims. She crouched carefully, feeling around until her fingers closed on what felt like a dagger hilt. The blade was gone, rusted away like the sword, but the crossguard might serve as a crude knuckle guard. "You've been sloppy," she said, hoping to provoke him into revealing more. "Elena is still alive. How does that fit into your careful plans?" The silence that followed was so complete that Arya wondered if she had somehow struck a nerve. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its confident warmth. "Elena is a complication. She was supposed to die months ago, but she proved surprisingly resilient, resourceful. She knows these tunnels almost as well as I do now. And you've been hunting her all this time." "Among other responsibilities, yes. But Elena is merely postponing the inevitable, as are you." Arya heard footsteps moving around the chamber's perimeter. Thomas was trying to flank her, to cut off potential escape routes. She gripped her makeshift weapons and prepared to move, but before she could take a step, another voice drifted out of the darkness. "He's lying about Elena." The voice was different from the weeping, broken woman Arya had encountered earlier. This Elena sounded steady, determined, and very much alive. "Show yourself, you little rat," Thomas snarled, his cultured facade cracking. "Face me like the noble lady you claim to be." "I've been facing you for 3 months, you murdering bastard," Elena replied from somewhere in the darkness, "and I've learned a few things about these tunnels that you haven't discovered yet." Arya heard the sound of running water, a stream or underground river flowing somewhere nearby. Eleanor's voice seemed to come from that direction. "Lady Blackwood," Eleanor continued, "there's a passage behind you to your left. It leads to the old cisterns. Follow the sound of my voice." "Don't listen to her," Thomas snapped. "She's trying to lead you into a trap." But Arya had already made her choice. Eleanor, whatever her condition, was not the enemy here. She began moving toward the sound of Eleanor's voice, using the broken weapons as crude tools to feel her way through the chamber. "Very well," Thomas said, his voice turning cold. "If you insist on making this difficult." The sound that followed chilled Arya's blood, the distinctive whisper of steel being drawn from a sheath. Thomas had a proper sword, a real weapon that would cut through her makeshift defenses like paper. "Run!" Elena shouted. Arya ran. The passage Elena had indicated was narrow and treacherous, forcing Arya to duck low as she moved. Behind her, she could hear Thomas cursing as he tried to follow, his larger frame struggling with the confined space. The sound of running water grew louder, and the air became noticeably more humid. "This way," Elena's voice guided her through the darkness. "There's a chamber ahead where the old aqueducts converge. We can make a stand there." "We?" Arya gasped as she stumbled forward. "You didn't think I'd let you face him alone, did you? I've been waiting 3 months for someone else to stumble into his web, someone who might actually be able to help me kill the bastard." Chapter 8. Alliance in the Dark. The chamber Eleanor led her to was vast, filled with the echoing sound of falling water. Arya could feel the spray on her face as underground streams cascaded from hidden heights, creating a network of pools and channels that had once supplied the castle with fresh water. The air was cooler here, cleaner, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and flowing water. "Careful of the edges," Elena warned, her voice now close enough that Arya could sense her presence. "Some of these pools are deeper than they appear, and the current can be treacherous." "How can you navigate so well in the dark?" Arya asked, keeping her voice low. 3 months of practice," Elena replied grimly. "When your life depends on knowing every stone, every passage, every hiding place, you learn quickly. I've mapped these tunnels in my mind, step by step, breath by breath." The sound of Thomas forcing his way through the narrow passage reached them, accompanied by increasingly creative profanity. "How do we fight him?" Arya asked. "He has a real sword and we have—" She held up her broken weapons, though Elena couldn't see them. "We have advantages he doesn't," Elena said. "I know which stones are loose, which ledges will support weight, where the water runs deepest. And now we have something I haven't had for months, an ally. What do you propose?" Before Elena could answer, Thomas emerged into the chamber with a splash as he stepped into one of the shallower pools. "Enough games," he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "This ends now, both of you." "Tell me, Thomas," Elena called back, her voice carrying a note of mockery that hadn't been there when she was playing the broken victim. "How does it feel to know that your perfect plan is falling apart, that the king will learn the truth when Lady Blackwood emerges at dawn?" "No one is emerging at dawn," Thomas replied. But Arya caught a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Are you sure about that?" Arya added, understanding Elena's strategy. "Because I've noticed something interesting about your victims. All nobles, all under suspicion, all convenient scapegoats. But I'm different, aren't I? I was specifically chosen, specifically framed. When I disappear, there will be questions. My brother knows I was coming here," Arya continued, the lie flowing smoothly. "He knows about the evidence we found regarding the embezzlement. If I don't return, he'll demand answers." It was a bluff, but Thomas couldn't know that. In the darkness, she heard him moving, his footsteps echoing off the wet stones as he tried to determine their positions. "Besides," Elena added, "you've made one crucial mistake in all of this." "And what might that be?" "You assumed the king was a fool who wouldn't eventually notice the pattern, that sooner or later he wouldn't realize that his trials had a perfect failure rate. Edmund is many things, but he's not stupid." The silence that followed suggested their words had struck home. Thomas had indeed grown overconfident, had assumed his deception could continue indefinitely. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Dead women tell no tales." "Then you'll have to catch us first," Elena replied. What happened next was a carefully orchestrated chaos. Elena, who had clearly planned for this moment, began moving through the chamber with the confidence of someone who knew every obstacle. Arya heard splashing, the scrape of feet on stone, and Thomas's frustrated curses as he tried to follow. "The water!" Elena hissed to Arya as she passed close by. "Use the sound of the water to mask your movements. Stay near the deeper pools. He won't risk falling in with a sword in his hand." Arya followed Elena's advice, moving carefully along the edges of the pools, while Thomas blundered through the chamber behind them. The sound of cascading water did indeed mask their footsteps, and the humid air seemed to muffle voices, making it difficult for Thomas to track them by sound alone. "You cannot run forever," Thomas called out, his earlier composure completely shattered. "These tunnels have no exit except the way we came. When dawn breaks, when the king sends guards to investigate, they'll find 3 bodies instead of 1. "Will they?" Elena's voice seemed to come from directly above them. "Are you certain about that, Thomas? Are you sure you know these tunnels as well as you think you do?" The doubt in Thomas's voice when he replied told Arya that Elena had found his weakness, his overconfidence in his own knowledge of the underground maze. "There are passages down here that predate the castle by centuries," Elena continued, moving again. "Roman foundations, Saxon tunnels, forgotten ways that haven't been used since the Norman conquest. I've had 3 months to explore them all." "Impossible," Thomas said, but he sounded less certain than before. "The old Roman sewers connect to the river," Eleanor said, her voice echoing from a new direction. "Did you know that? There's a grate about half a mile downstream from the castle. It's rusted, but not beyond repair. Not if you have 3 months to work on it and strong motivation to escape." Arya began to understand Elena's strategy. She wasn't just trying to confuse Thomas, she was revealing that escape was possible, that his perfect murder scheme had a fatal flaw. "Even if that were true," Thomas said, "you'd never make it that far. The tunnels are treacherous, and you'd be moving in complete darkness. As opposed to what? Elena laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber. Staying here to be murdered by a treacherous steward? I'll take my chances with the tunnels. Arya heard Thomas moving again, more frantically now, as the reality of his situation began to sink in. His plan was unraveling. His victims were proving more resourceful than anticipated, and dawn was still hours away. But cornered animals were the most dangerous, and Arya knew that Thomas would soon abandon subtlety in favor of a direct, desperate attack. The final confrontation was approaching, and she gripped her makeshift weapons tighter, preparing for the moment when words would no longer be enough to keep them alive. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The psychological warfare had pushed Thomas to his breaking point. Arya could hear it in his breathing, harsh, ragged, the sound of a man whose careful plans were crumbling around him. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. "Enough!" The word echoed through the cistern chamber like a thunderclap. "I'm done playing games with you, bitches." The crude vulgarity was jarring after his earlier cultured speech, revealing the brutal man beneath the civilized facade. Arya heard him moving with renewed purpose, no longer trying for stealth, but simply charging through the water toward where he thought they were hiding. "He's lost his temper," Elena whispered, so close that Arya could feel her breath. "That's good. Angry men make mistakes." "What's the plan?" Arya whispered back. "There's a passage that leads to the Roman tunnels about 20 feet behind you. When I give the signal, run for it. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run." "What about you?" "Someone needs to delay him, give you time to reach the exit. I'm not leaving you to face him alone." Elena's hand found Arya's in the darkness, squeezing briefly. "Listen to me. I've been running from this monster for 3 months. I'm tired, I'm weak, and I'm not going to last much longer. But you? You're strong, you're fresh, and you have something I don't." "What?" "Someone who will believe you when you tell them what happened here. Someone with the power to bring Thomas to justice." Before Arya could protest further, Elena was moving. "Thomas!" she called out, her voice carrying across the chamber. "Over here, you murdering coward!" The sound of splashing erupted as Thomas charged toward Elena's voice. In the darkness, Arya heard the clash of metal against stone. Elena had found some kind of weapon, probably another rusted blade from Thomas's collection of victims. "Run!" Elena shouted. Arya ran. The passage Elena had indicated was narrow and sloped downward at a steep angle. Arya had to feel her way carefully to avoid falling, even as the sounds of combat echoed behind her. She heard Elena cry out, pain or effort she couldn't tell, and had to fight every instinct that told her to turn back and help. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and branching in ways that would have been impossible to navigate without Elena's directions. The sound of flowing water grew louder, and the air began to carry new scents: mud, vegetation, the clean smell of the outside world. Behind her, the sounds of fighting had stopped. Either Elena had escaped, or Arya forced herself not to think about the alternative. Elena had sacrificed herself to give Arya a chance. The only way to honor that sacrifice was to survive, to escape, to bring the truth to light. The tunnel opened suddenly into a larger space, and Arya nearly fell into what felt like a fast-flowing underground river. The current was strong enough that she could hear it rushing past, carrying debris and the promise of freedom. This had to be Elena's escape route, the old Roman sewer that connected to the river outside the castle. But how was she supposed to navigate it in complete darkness? The current would sweep her away, and she had no idea how far it was to the exit Elena had mentioned. A sound behind her made the decision for her. Heavy footsteps echoing through the tunnel, moving fast. Thomas had won his fight with Elena and was in pursuit. "I can smell your fear, Lady Blackwood." His voice drifted down the tunnel, closer than she had expected. The sweet scent of desperation. "There's nowhere left to run." Arya looked down at the rushing water, invisible in the darkness but audible and terrifyingly real. It might kill her, but staying would certainly kill her. At least the river offered a chance. She jumped. The water was shockingly cold, driving the breath from her lungs as the current seized her and swept her away. The tunnel walls rushed past, invisible but occasionally scraping against her arms and legs as she tumbled through the narrow channel. She tried to keep her head above water, tried to protect herself from the rocks and debris that the current carried, but it was like being caught in a liquid avalanche. Time lost all meaning. She might have been in the water for minutes or hours. There was only the roar of the current, the desperate struggle to breathe, and the growing certainty that she was going to drown in the darkness beneath Raven's hollow castle. Then, impossibly, she saw light, pale grey light that seemed impossibly bright after hours in absolute darkness. The tunnel ahead was growing larger, and she could see the iron grate that Elena had described, rusted, partially collapsed, but wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Arya hit the grate with painful force, the current pinning her against the metal bars. For a terrifying moment, she thought she would be trapped there, held underwater until she drowned. But the damaged grate gave way under the pressure, and she tumbled through into the open river beyond. The Raven's Hollow flowed past the castle walls, swollen with autumn rains and carrying her downstream at frightening speed. But she was alive, she was free, and above her she could see the first pale hints of dawn beginning to touch the eastern sky. She had survived the night. Chapter 10. Dawn's Justice. Captain Roderick found her an hour after sunrise, collapsed on the riverbank 3 miles downstream from the castle. Arya was barely conscious, her body racked with cold and exhaustion, but alive. The captain's weathered face showed genuine surprise as he helped her to her feet. "My lady," he said, wrapping his own cloak around her shivering form. You survived." "Thomas Gray," Arya managed through chattering teeth. "He's the killer. The embezzlement. My father. All of it." Roderick's expression shifted from surprise to grim understanding. "We'll get you back to the castle. The king will want to hear everything." The ride back to Raven's Hollow was a blur of concerned faces and urgent questions. Word had somehow spread that Lady Blackwood had not only survived the king's trial, but had emerged from an entirely different location than expected. By the time they reached the castle gates, a crowd had gathered in the courtyard. King Edmund was waiting in the great hall, but this time he was not alone on his throne. Thomas Gray stood beside him, playing the part of the concerned steward who had spent the night praying for Arya's safe return. When he saw her enter, soaking wet and supported by guards, his face went through a remarkable transformation. Shock, fear, and desperate calculation all flickering across his features before settling into a mask of false relief. "My lady!" Thomas exclaimed, rushing forward. "Thank God you're alive. We feared the worst when dawn came and you hadn't emerged from the dungeon." Arya looked directly at him, seeing him clearly for the first time in the light of day. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40, with the soft hands and pale complexion of a man who worked with ledgers rather than swords, but his eyes held a coldness that she now recognized as the look of a killer. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the hall. "I survived your trial, Thomas. All of it." The word "your" hung in the air like an accusation. Thomas's false smile faltered. "My lady, I fear your ordeal has confused you," he said carefully. "You faced His Majesty's trial, not mine. I've been here in the castle all night attending to my duties." "Have you?" King Edmund's voice cut through the hall like a blade. He had risen from his throne and was studying both of them with intense interest. "Thomas, tell me, what duties kept you occupied throughout the night?" "The usual accounts, Your Majesty. Correspondence with the Northern Lords. Nothing of great import." "Interesting." The king descended the steps of his dais slowly. "Because Captain Roderick tells me that Lady Blackwood emerged not from the dungeon where I left her, but from the river, 3 miles downstream. How do you suppose she managed that?" Thomas's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. I couldn't say, Your Majesty. Perhaps there are passages in the old foundations that we don't know about." "Oh, there are," Arya said, finding her strength. "Passages you know very well, Thomas. Passages where you've been murdering innocent people for months while making it appear they died in the king's trials." A gasp rippled through the assembled court. Thomas stepped back, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt, where a dagger hung. "That's preposterous," he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "Your Majesty, surely you don't believe—" "What I believe," King Edmund interrupted, "is that Lady Blackwood has had a very interesting night, and I think we should hear her story in full before we draw any conclusions." Arya told them everything. The maze of tunnels, the chamber filled with bones, Eleanor's 3-month struggle for survival, and Thomas's confession to murdering her father and orchestrating the embezzlement. She spoke clearly and precisely, despite her exhaustion, while Thomas's face grew paler with each revelation. When she finished, the hall was silent except for the crackling of torches. "A fascinating tale," King Edmund said thoughtfully. "Thomas, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Thomas straightened, apparently deciding that his only chance lay in bold denial. "Your Majesty, this woman has clearly suffered some kind of mental breakdown from her ordeal. These wild accusations—" "Show them your hands," Arya interrupted. "What?" "Show them your hands, Thomas. The hands that have never done manual labor, that have never held a real weapon in combat. Show them how clean they are for a man who supposedly spent the night doing paperwork." Thomas's hands were indeed clean, suspiciously so for someone who claimed to have been working all night. But more damning were the fresh scratches on his arms and face, marks that could have come from fighting in narrow stone passages. "Captain Roderick," the king commanded, "take a team of men and search the tunnels beneath the castle. Look for evidence of what Lady Blackwood describes." "Your Majesty," Thomas said desperately, "surely this is unnecessary." "And arrest Thomas Grey," the king continued calmly. "Hold him until we know the truth." Thomas's composure finally cracked completely. With a snarl of rage, he drew his dagger and lunged toward Arya, perhaps hoping that if he could kill her, he could still salvage his situation. He never reached her. Captain Roderick's sword took him through the chest, the blade emerging between his shoulder blades in a spray of blood. Thomas Grey, murderer and traitor, died on the stone floor of the very hall where he had stood in false judgment of his victims. As the steward's body was carried away, King Edmund approached Arya. In the morning light streaming through the tall windows, she could see that his grey eyes held something she hadn't expected: respect. "Lady Blackwood," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. You came to my court accused of treason, and instead you have exposed a true traitor who has been using my name to commit murder." "What will happen to Elena?" Arya asked. "Lady Elena of Westfield. If she's still alive in those tunnels, she'll be found and cared for," the king promised. "And if she has indeed survived as you describe, she'll be honored as a hero of the realm." Arya nodded, swaying slightly from exhaustion and relief. It was over. The nightmare was over, and justice had been served. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "about your trials." Edmund's expression grew thoughtful. "Yes, it seems my reputation for infallibility was based on false premises. Perhaps it's time to reconsider some of my methods." As Arya was led away to receive medical attention and rest, she heard the king addressing his court. His words followed her down the corridor like a promise. "Let it be known throughout the realm that Lady Arya Blackwood has proven her innocence beyond all doubt. Let it also be known that King Edmund's justice shall no longer be hidden in darkness, but conducted in the light of day, where all may see its fairness." The sun was fully up now, warming the castle stones and driving away the shadows of the longest night of Arya's life. She had entered the king's hall as a condemned traitor and emerged as a vindicated hero. More importantly, she had kept her promise to her father. Honor was indeed not in never falling, but in how one chose to rise, and Lady Arya Blackwood had risen triumphant.